My name is Michelle Jacko, and I will be your moderator today. I'm the managing partner of Jacko Law Group. I'm also the CEO of Core Compliance and Legal Services. And I'm really excited to talk to you today about a topic that we all have to perform this year, which is the annual review. And I am joined, I'm happy to say, by my veteran panelists who are going to share a lot of years of experience. Gretchen Lee is with Clifford Swan Investment Counselors, and Kevin Ehrlich is with Western Asset Management Company. So without further ado, I wanted to tell you we're really going to be covering 4 topics today. And for those of you that expect to hear about Rule 20647, that is not this session. We're going to be talking in general. I think we all know the 3 prongs, right? We don't have to go through those, of what the compliance program rule stands for. But we're going to be talking about some very practical questions about techniques for the annual review, as well as considerations to how to really enhance the process. So, a question that is frequently asked is truly, how robust does the annual review have to be? And, when we start taking a look back in hindsight, and I've been doing this for 26 years now, so I was doing compliance before the compliance program rule. When this came out, I remember, thinking about what is its true purpose. And it really boils down to, I have to identify the risks that are inherent in the business and then develop policies and procedures that are reasonably designed, right, to prevent those violations of federal securities laws. And I've got to test to see if they're really working. And when we go through that, through the years, since we're a principle-based regulation, we have to think about how do we learn what is enough? Is it robust enough? And we're going to be turning to, I hate to say this, yes, rules by enforcement, okay? So we look at the enforcement actions and we find out what doesn't the SEC want to see? What are the big gaps and deficiencies that are being noted that warrant, settlements and enforcement? We then take a look at the various risk alerts. In 2021 alone, there were 9 risk alerts. Okay, and we are continuing to see them come out now. We also then start seeing certain trends and patterns that are coming out in SEC exams. In the last year, saw a number of firms that were written up for incompetency of the CCO that then also addressed resource issues and challenges, which I know many firms face, and then the actual practicalness of the policies and procedures themselves. So, I wanted to start by turning to Gretchen. We're going to have various discussion points that we're going to be bringing up. When you're conducting the annual review, what are some of the top resources that you turn to? How do you approach this?
So at my firm, we have 30 employees, and I am really fortunate because we have a very strong tone at the top in compliance. And really, when I'm looking at my annual review process, I'm looking at that instead of at the annual level as more of an ongoing thing that we're doing consistently. So every day I have that sort of process going in my mind. Is this something that I'm doing that is at the end of the year documented? Am I doing it properly? Am I meeting some of those, answering the questions that are put forward in some of the materials that we've provided to you? So for me, it's ongoing.
And do you also conduct a risk assessment to kind of launch the process?
We do.
Or?
So we have kind of 2 components at our firm. We look at it from a risk-based view, which is very specific to the act and the rules we get from the SEC. But on the other end, we're really looking at our compliance manual and drilling down into those policies to ensure that we are doing what we say is in our manual.
Okay. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was going to add 2 things. Number 1, we want this to be pragmatic, so if you've got questions about how we do things, please don't feel shy about asking them. We'll do our best to answer them, and if not during the session, you can always hunt any of the 3 of us down after the fact, and we'll do our best to share our wisdom. I guess the one thing that I'll add is we think about doing this because the SEC tells us to, but when I approach my reviews, I think about this, what I need to do so that I can sleep at night. So the kinds of questions that I'm asking are not necessarily all driven by just from what an SEC alert says. It's I'm proactively identifying. I'm proactively thinking about where are my blind spots. I'm proactively thinking about, again, where do I think I'm uncertain about things, or where do I think I can add value to the business by giving them comfort that things are working appropriately. So there's a little bit of a proactive element to that, aside from whatever the rule happens to say.
Yeah, and what I'm going to do is that each of the sections, okay, I'm going to actually pause and let you know what's in your materials, because sometimes we get so caught up in the conference we don't know. There are some of the most amazing resources out there from back when the rule was launched. So in 2006, there were a list of questions that the SEC staff actually gave advisors of, these are the questions you should be asking during your annual reviews. So if you're not familiar with them, I will tell you some of these questions are in the very SEC exams you may encounter in the near term. Okay, so do take a look at that when you have an opportunity. Before I forget, I don't want to not give you the first session, or excuse me, the first continuing education word for this session, which is the word season. Again, the word is season. Okay, as we turn now to really some of the practical tips, again, we take the start of, we've conducted the risk assessment, we've identified some of the areas in the policies and procedures that may need to be enhanced or documented. And, it's important for us now to take a step back, and we're going to have to try to document our findings in order to really be able to evidence that we conducted the annual review. And so it was interesting. I was going through an SEC exam with a client last week, and one of the examiners said to the client, "We're so glad you don't have to put this in writing, but if you didn't have it in writing, we didn't know that you actually conducted that." So taking that in mind, I think that, one of the ways that they're taking a look and seeing, how did the annual review effectuate change? Kevin, when you get done with the annual review, there may be areas in the annual that needs to get enhanced in your policies and procedures. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think about this on a range. The first question I ask is, how urgent is the issue? If it's a question that's putting client assets at risk, if it's a question that's putting you at a high exam risk, if the SEC was to come in tomorrow, those are the things that you prioritize and probably escalate much more quickly. If it's more of the nice to have, I'll put a margin note in my manual, the next time I make an update, I'll tweak it, that kind of thing. So the first question I always ask is gravity, speed of onset. If there was something to go wrong about this particular thing, where would it emerge, and what would be the consequence? And then that's how I figure out my approach and who I need to talk to and with what degree of urgency I need to talk to them.
And do you approach, when you're doing this, is this more of like an ongoing process, or is this something that you're doing just once a year?
Yeah, I think the annual is probably the biggest misnomer of this whole rule. Annual is a baseline, it's a floor. The way that we think of annual, it's the bow that you tidy up and just go look back over the prior 4 quarters and say, how was your year? What happened? Did you do things? So it's, for us, our annual is a little more year in review, but we do testing on a regular basis. Largely because if something goes bump in the night, I don't want to find it 13 months from now. I want to find it now. Again, I have business reasons, I have sleep at night reasons to have that degree of urgency. So annual to us, that's just the bow that ties the program together, but you should be doing things on a much more frequent basis. But your business model, your risks, the activities that happen on a daily basis in your shop, that will inform the degree of frequency that you want to do your own testing as well.
Right, I think the definition of robust is different for each one of us. Our firms are extremely different, and so I'm really judging when I'm doing reviews of certain policies and procedures based on what I have in my manual. So I kind of base the calendar on what has been given a priority and then what frequency we've given to that area.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say is that when I think about robust, it's really hard. It's like, how much insurance is enough? And you often don't know until after you've had a crash, right? So again, this is why I kind of go back to, what is it that I need to know so that I can sleep at night? And that's the little voice inside my gut that says, have I asked enough? Have I done the right questions?
Right.
But I don't claim that my testing steps are statistically significant sample sizes or, ISO whatever, or SOC whatever. I mean, those are all things that you can use to think about it yourself, but it really, for me, it's that gut. Can I go home and sleep at night? Have I done enough so that I get comfort?
Yeah, and I think too, Kevin, that the review process is a guideline so that at the end of the year, you have looked at your entire compliance program. Well, I think I've looked at my personal trading policy about 12 times in the last 8 weeks. So we've just had some issues at our firm, and I know that I don't need to look at that, but maybe I haven't looked at my BCP since 2020 when we all went out because of the COVID pandemic.
Yes, and I'll tell you what we're going to be doing, okay, again, is the IAA, as always, has provided an amazing resource, okay, and this is on interim reviews. It's annual and interim, and so if you wanted some ideas for testing, okay, so we gave you questions, and we've got testing. They've given this in this handout, so this is within your materials. Okay. So now, we've been talking about, the annual review as a process, and more specifically, how we've been going about and identifying risks. And one of the things that Gretchen shared with us is that she really utilizes her area managers to accomplish a lot of that. So I was wondering if you could, share with us today, how do you get your area managers involved in the process?
Well, I think originally they were strong-armed. But I think, as I mentioned, we have a great just compliance awareness at my firm. So we have taken the principals of our firm, we're wholly employee owned, and we have given them each an area of responsibility within the compliance program. So some of them serve on a committee like best execution or trading. Others, I use them as a sounding board because I am the compliance department. So it's really great. And then at each quarter, we have something that we've deemed a compliance questionnaire, and it asks questions within those areas of their supervision. And so they are answering the questions, and then I get to review that. Mm-hmm. So it gives more of a, the culture is involved in the whole process.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, when you go through an SEC exam, that's one of the things that I know, and I will tell you, and I've been on those interviews where the staff is asking, why didn't you, that's the portfolio manager, understand what compliance was doing to trade? And if they're involved in the process, they can intelligibly answer that.
Yeah, and it will, if you are looking for a way to involve those in your firm, it kind of becomes very apparent who should be on which committees based on their area of expertise or their role in your firm. So sometimes you just kind of have to take a back seat and say, okay, what is this person's responsibilities at my firm? If they're obviously the trader, then you have them on your trading committee. But my best execution has my equity analyst, my fixed income analyst, and then someone from our research staff. So it sort of makes it a broad variety of people. It's not just only those upper level people in our firm.
I'm going to add a thought from a completely different perspective. Identify where in your shop people are already doing things that are quality assurance in nature. You don't have to duplicate effort. If somebody's already doing something, maybe you can piggyback on what they're doing. You don't want to bug them. You don't want to take the time away from what their day job is if they're already accomplishing that goal some other way. So you might have to change your testing steps. So instead of doing the test yourself, you're looking at the output of their process and validating their process and looking for those kind of exceptions. But again, piggyback on work that other people are doing, leverage the work that other things that are happening in your shop. If you have people that are doing GIPS affirmations or SOC 1 internal controls, those kind of things, people are already asking and answering some of the same questions that you would.
And I'll just share with you, okay, we're not going to go through every single bullet on the slide, okay? So this is provided you for reference materials and things like that because we've got a very dynamic discussion that's going to be coming up with regards to the approach, okay? And again, just want to remind you, if you have any questions, there are note cards, and there'll be somebody going around to collect those. So feel free to either raise your hand or let us know. But, it's really interesting for me, again, we saw in 2020 this risk alert that came out about OC, now exams, observations that, were found as they were reviewing compliance programs. And I think, for all of us, we knew a lot about what they were saying, but it really went to the heart of compliance resources. What is the process? Is it dynamic? Okay? And are we involving enough folks to really engage. And when I started in this industry, and I am sorry to say this, okay, we were kind of joking about this. It used to be the secretary will just do compliance, okay? It was kind of, we don't need to worry about it. And the industry is no longer that is for sure. And I think that, one of the things that, I want you to think about is everything that we're doing as part of the risk-based approach. We've got to look at, not only the SEC, examination deficiencies noted in the past. We've got to take a look at the risk alerts. But most importantly, what we haven't mentioned is, that infamous phrase, conflicts of interest. Okay, there's so much emphasis going on right now by the staff on where is your conflict, and they are directly mapping that to your policies and procedures. And so, when the compliance program rule came out, you used to say, there's the list of the top 10, okay, top 10 policies and procedures, we've got this. That's no longer the case because everything has got to be customized to the business. What are your activities? How are you compensated? How are we mitigating the conflicts? So that mitigation comes in the form of developing internal controls. So you might have surveillance efforts, but a big part of that are your policies and procedures. So I'm going to encourage you, as part of your annual review this year, to really try to map out, if we have a conflict, it's not just where it's mitigated, it's how are we actually overseeing that mitigation, okay? And so those are just, different foods for thought. We also have the OC observation information of the risk alert, the 2020 risk alert in your handout. So now we're going to be turning to, really, the next section, which are the types of tests that can be conducted. There's obviously the transactional at the point of transaction, periodically, like best execution you might be reviewing quarterly, or we have forensic. How is someone trying to circumvent the compliance program area? And, over the years, I've seen so many different approaches taken. And I was hoping, Kevin, you could really share with us today, what is the frequency of your testing and how's that kind of rolling up into your annual review?
So I love the idea of setting up your first area of question is what's my conflict of interests? And what are my risks, mapping through the policies and mapping really to the question of how do you know? And if you can answer that question, how do you know, reverse engineer that into the test steps and the questions that you need to ask. We put our topics through a bit of a risk matrix where we get a sense of the things that are more risky we're going to look at more often. We're going to look at the things that don't have other eyeballs on them, probably a little more often. Again, if the SEC comes in and says, have you been thoughtful about the design of your program? We can show this is how we've laid things out. But we typically run on a quarterly basis, so the things that are the most risky, we're looking on a quarterly basis, but that's not a substitute for things that people are doing in the trenches on a day-to-day basis. So for example, we have people looking at marketing materials on a day-to-day basis. We have people looking at portfolio compliance guidelines on a day-to-day basis. My annual program isn't part of that per se, but on a quarterly basis, I'm going back and looking at those processes and saying, are those processes that are operating on a day-to-day basis functioning the way that they should be? Is there anything coming out of those that we should know about? So the way that I think about my frequency, it's an overlay, but not a substitute for the underlying things that are happening in the course of regular operations. But the other thing that I'll say is there's nothing that says you have to be consistent. You can change the testing you're doing from quarter to quarter. That little voice that I was talking about before, I've had times where I say, okay, this quarter, I'm really going to focus on this thing. And maybe I'm going to go a little more narrow, but I'm going to go much deeper. So my sample sizes are going to be a lot more robust because it's going to take me more time to read through all of those marketing decks or those RFP responses or whatever the question is that I have. But then the next quarter, I can revert back to whatever my standard was. It's whatever you need to do to allow you to sleep at night. So don't feel constrained just because you've done something that way in the past. You can change your test, or you can add a test for one quarter and ditch it the next quarter. It's whatever you need to do to ask and answer the question of how do you know? We talked about documentation. No, take credit for those things.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add, and I used to do this when I was a CCO, you'd be amazed, okay? One of the things I would suggest you do is actually do some mock SEC interview questions with not only the managers, I'd actually go down to the staff level, okay? And I used to oversee surveillance, and as we were going through and looking at exception reportings and things like that, it was amazing to me because what I found so quickly is the processes that they were doing had evolved, the manual had not, or their SOPs had not. Okay, and so that becomes, and I know that, there's different firms with different approaches on how you do things. So much more is, automated, and it becomes just a process of that automation. But, the bigger questions to ask are, especially when you have new hires, do you even know what you're looking for? Because we can have all the automation in the world, it's got to be interpreted. And, the question is there enough guidance on that? And if the staff were to sit down with folks and really talk about the actual process, which I'm seeing a lot more interaction during examinations, that's where I see, different gaps being identified.
Yeah, two thoughts, and this is really critical. One of the ways that I describe the review process to my internal staff this isn't a compliance obligation. I describe it as ongoing exam prep.
Right.
I want to ask the question before an examiner asks. And to the point of getting staff involved, I also tell people, look, when the SEC's coming in, they don't want to hear from me. I'm not the one doing the work. They're going to want to hear from you. So it's a little bit of an opportunity of a quasi dry run, but to tee them up with the idea that you got to take some ownership of what your questions are and get some practice of, well, where would you find those records?
Or, and I will even share this, or encourage them if there's a better way of doing things, if there's a gap that they're seeing, to bring it and to escalate to your attention.
And then when that happens, take credit for that, because the SEC is going to say that's a real tangible example of an organic adaption that's taking into account what you've heard and feeding it back into your process to make it better. All of this should be organic, right?
Right.
All of this should be ongoing, take into account the data, the exceptions, whatever, adjust, move on, adjust, move on.
One of the things that I've done at my firm is I've created something we call the SEC audit roadmap. So I've taken several examination letters and I've put that into a spreadsheet and then put the response as to where that information could be found, or who the area in which into whom's responsibility that falls, because then that way I'm 2 steps ahead, right? Like, question number 1 always is, please give us your org chart. Well, so I make sure that our org chart is revised and ready to go. But I mean, it's very simple, but drilling down into that, I know who to ask, to your point, and then also where it's stored or where it can be found.
That's right. And as we go into, documenting the annual results, we've gone through this process where we've identified the risks, we're taking a look, mapping that to the internal controls, we're seeing what could be done better, what's working just fine, what we might want to advance. There's so many different ways to document this. So, Gretchen, I'm a little bit curious to know, when we think about the methodology of how you go about documenting your findings, what are you doing?
Well, I think a lot, but a little, right? So because it's an ongoing approach, I'm making notes and commenting about anything that I have found or what I've reviewed in a certain period of time. But then it also affords me the ability to know, okay, this is an area I really need to look at more thoroughly. And so that in that area, I might have a much more robust written report with findings and what's happened and any remediation that we've taken, or if we've had to address a concern, say over client agreements with our outside counsel, anything like that, then I have it documented and I'm refreshed, because I don't know about you, but my brain gets overloaded sometimes when I'm doing all of these ongoing tasks, that honestly, again, having it as the annual review, I remember, okay, I've done these and I need to still review this part too. So really the roadmap and the questionnaire at my firm are really the driving forces.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, how many of you are actually doing like a written report versus an Excel spreadsheet? Written report. Okay, Excel spreadsheet or similar. Okay, a handful. Yeah, and I've seen what about a combination of both? Okay, yeah, and that's kind of the happy medium. And I've seen the SEC. They've, it's funny. They commented to one of my clients. They said, "Boy, we really like this." It was just a written report, and they had kind of converted to the dual method. And they're in the middle of an exam, and they said, "You know what? let's go take a step back. We're going to go back to that long written report because they liked it. And I said, there's no right or wrong way. There's just making sure we've memorialized what we're doing to document and evidence it. But, we have an amazing sample, and we call this the oldie but the goodie,
Oh
right?
my gosh, I pulled that thing out from 10 years ago, probably.
And so what this does, this is a different kind of approach. We're just trying to give you different ideas, folks. It's not one size fits all, as we all know in compliance. And what this really does is breaks it down by subject matter. If you wanted to do a written report, what are some of the things that we need to think about, from updating your policies and memorializing that to meeting minutes for subcommittees and different things the ways that, and I would insert training programs. Have you trained on this year, including continuing education, such as coming to this conference and then sharing those ideas with folks.
Yeah, for any of you that are wearing multiple hats, you might want to look at this as an example of ways to also disseminate some information and duties and responsibilities to others in your firm.
Okay. My favorite speech of all times dates back, to March 15th, 2004. And I don't know how many of you remember Lori Richards. She was someone that was just a very dynamic in her presentation and was so passionate about the annual review when it was initially deployed. And she gave this speech about putting the compliance program to work, And I loved the way that she did this because she described this really as a process. She called it 7. I'm going to make it a 6-step process. And I'm just going to quickly go through that because I think this is really at the heart of where if there are deficiencies in an annual review, this is where things are not being done. So this is all in our speech and your materials, but the first thing is we really want to start by conducting an inventory of compliance obligations. What am I supposed to be doing? And all that comes down to your business practices, right? What were our products, services, what have you, and what we're doing for our clients. Then I'm going to be able to, number 2, identify my conflicts of interest. And I would suggest if you're not doing so already, really do a conflict inventory. Beginning of the year, it helps so much. And we hear all about the buzz about compensation arrangements and how we're going to need to disclose this even more and more as we go into the new marketing role and solicitor, now promoter arrangements, right? We're going to have to do this anyway. So the books that were closed by finance in the past, sometimes to the compliance officer, they are not open. That's where your conflicts are found, compensation arrangements. We then want to match, number 3, our compliance practices to our compliance obligations and conflicts. So again, mapping the conflicts, to the policies and procedures. Number 4, then I've got to actually assess the effectiveness of the compliance function. Do we have oversight? Do we have resources? How are we able to deploy this? Do I have enough staff, human capital? Number 5, we have to identify additional compliance processes that are warranted and then implement them. And I will say this is easier said than done because in the business, there's regulation and there's business, and not all the time do they nicely mesh together. And we understand that. So one of the things that you're going to want to do when you go back to your firms is I often say, look, we need to do an impact analysis. If we do this, who's impacted and how are they impacted? Do we need training? Do we need resources? Do we need technology? What's the cost of that? And I'm going to escalate that to senior management so that they're aware, And then finally, number 6, we're going to test the process and make sure that it is working. And so what Lori really said in this speech is that the annual review, if you do all those steps, it's a systematic process. And I think, Kevin, you said it best at the beginning. Our role in compliance is we want to be able to sleep at night. We're trying to protect, number 1, our clients. Number 2, our firm, and everybody in there. And, I think that one of the things that we need to be thinking about is in terms of how we go about this in this process. And so, Kevin, I'm going to turn to you and ask you, as we're talking about this, how are you utilizing all the different resources available to you to deploy this as part of your annual review. I know you talked about it in part, but I think that there's this whole other layer when you talk about the totality of everything that has to happen. It really is a group effort.
It has to be a group effort, but the other thing that I want to highlight is we want to demystify this a little bit. It can look big and ugly, and it can look like, geez, more work, and I've got enough other things to do. But part of when we talk about how to think about this or how to break it down into pieces, it's just break it down into pieces. It's be methodical about it. It doesn't need to be big and scary. Now, yes, can you do more testing? You can always do more testing. Yes, could you be more engaged with the business? Sure, you can probably always be more engaged with the business, all those kind of things. But a lot of what this is really allowing you to do as a compliance professional is to be better engaged with your colleagues, give them better advice. You want to get to a point where this gives you the kind of knowledge that you're not just doing this stuff because it's compliant. You're doing this stuff because you can add value, and your colleagues want you in the room because you're identifying issues, you're spotting issues, I was going to see if the word prevent is on this slide, but you're preventing things. You're looking into the future because of the knowledge that you've gained, because of the questions you've asked. You can, not just for the SEC purposes, think of a client is going to come in on a due diligence visit at some point and say blah, 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 blah. Well, you've already asked and answered some of those questions. So when I think about how I organize myself, some of it is about the documentation and about the Excel spreadsheets. But a lot of it is also the diplomatic approach. It's, are you inviting yourself to meetings? Are you walking around? Are you keeping your ear to the ground? Are you plugged into the pulse of the business? And frankly, one of the things that's great about being a CCO is you have an excuse to have a really horizontal view across all aspects of the business. So again, for me, that's brain food. I get to walk up and ask people dumb questions, and I can learn from that, and I can take credit for that. Hey, this is my job, right? But that's an entree, that's an opening into other things, and sometimes those questions find their way into formal documentation. Other places they don't, but they better inform me in terms of how I'm allocating my time or prioritizing the things that I choose to raise to others or advocate for fixing or advocate for resources. We all know time and resources are finite. So a big part of this is being able to attune your sense of what really is important, what's critical, to be able to understand trade-offs, so that when you talk with your colleagues or your senior management, either about what they're spending time on or priorities or resources, you can speak with a much greater sense of gravity.
I think you make a good point about the diplomacy. My firm has 30 people, and so it's very easy for me to walk around and engage in conversations on a daily basis with everybody at my firm. So I sort of am in their daily business. So I feel as if they don't just see me as, oh no, here comes the compliance officer. So if you're at a bigger firm, you probably have some ways that you can get out and talk to people in a more relaxed setting, maybe. It's not always the compliance hat that you're wearing. So then when you do have an issue or you want to ask some more pointed questions, you're a little more well-received.
I wanted, in the final slide in this section, before I think what's going to cause the most amount of banter in this presentation, I want to point out something that I'm seeing more and more in SEC examinations. This final one about, there's two. Insufficient authority of the CCO. If you're in a firm, which I hope you're not because you're all here at this conference, where you feel that you do not have sufficient authority, I'm going to ask you, as you're looking at your policies and procedures, does your manual keep on saying that the CCO is responsible for this? Okay, your job as a CCO should be one of oversight, not to be the area supervisor. And if you do not have the authority and the seniority to truly act upon if there is a deficiency, what do we do? Your job should be to escalate to senior management to make the final determination with, of course, your recommendation of what actions should be taken. But that onus falls on them, not you. So think about that as you're looking at your policies and procedures this year. The other thing is that in the annual review of deficiencies about advisors not having enough resources, okay? One of the questions that I'm seeing again and again is we really do want to see your compliance budget. I know we talked about that. There was buzz years past. They're looking into it, and they're wanting to know for different technologies. I don't care if it's with deployment of the new DOL rule, if it's with different ways that you're utilizing social media, how are you surveying it, what are the technologies you're using? That is a very specific question. So if technology is not part of your compliance program, there's a lot of different technologies out there, they will question it even if you're a small advisor. It's just too hard for the human eye to catch everything with today's day and age. This by far is the hardest topic, okay? No firm is perfect, okay? And every business, there are risks, there are conflicts, and no business is perfect. And I think the hardest part is that when we go about identifying issues, what do you do? Okay, and in terms of the annual review, you hear so many times, the annual review, I don't want that as a roadmap with a bullseye on my back. And how do I do this and present this in such a way, that we can, make sure that this is becoming a guidance of these were the compliance issues and here's how we handled it and addressed them. So Kevin, I got to turn to you first, sir, and ask you, there's so many different approaches. What are you doing if you identify an issue?
Yeah, as I talked about before, I think the first thing is to assess the gravity.
Mm-hmm.
It's to assess the urgency. And our fiduciary duty to our client means you have to figure out first, is this going to have an impact on my client and how quickly? That's a major issue. And once you find that, it's not, to me, you'll document it later, but if it's that urgent, I'm not waiting to document that a year from now. I'm on the phone now, right? So you kind of have to measure what kinds of things you identify. But then, as Gretchen said, the diplomacy of knowing how to document things, how to write things. There are ways to write things that are better. There's also ways to write things that are worse, right? You could find yourself in a position where if you don't write this appropriately, you can turn it into a bullseye. You should not write this annual report in a way that you're going to use this as a sword to go threaten your senior management for resources. That's career limiting, right? That's not a great way to do it. So this is the classic principles-based approach where there are different ways to do it. And maybe there's no right or wrong, but there are definitely ways that are wronger, right? So having that diplomatic writing, we always call it writing for the record. You have to presume that somebody from the SEC, or could even be a private litigant, it's not just a regulatory risk here, but you have to presume that this is a record of what you did or what you didn't do. That doesn't mean it's a personal diary of every day of your existence, but it is also a snapshot of an overview of some of your process. The discussion point here about the two different versions, we do create two different versions. I create one version that is my internal. And for my internal, it's a little more granular, and it doesn't have a lot of overview or background of the firm or its structure. For my client-facing version, I'm a little less granular because I want to make sure that I can be candid in my review and not turn every little thing into a client service issue. But my client summary also includes more background on my firm and my structure because I'm presuming that the audience reading this might not be familiar with us or might not have the benefit of a due diligence meeting where I can explain things. So my client summary needs to stand on its own. So it's a little more high level and a little more generic, but in my business, and this is why you have to know your client base, it's a common thing that we get asked in due diligence questionnaires. So we're always walking that balance where I want we talked about using the word robust earlier. I want my testing to be as robust as it needs to be so I can sleep at night. But I also don't want to turn things into a weird incentive that I'm afraid to document something because the client's going to beat me up over something that's small or whatever. So you have to kind of walk those lines, and this is one of the tools that we've used to make give ourselves a little bit of space to be robust in the internal, but also give some clients comfort about our process.
Yeah, and I'll share with you, this thought came to mind as you were talking about due diligence questionnaires. For those of you, and it doesn't even matter anymore. There used to be really the institutional side got RFPs. I'm seeing smaller advisors get RFPs right now. Investors want to know if they're using you as a third-party asset manager, for example. They're going to be sending you questionnaires. And frequently the question is, could you share with us your annual review report? And I've seen, that's usually the reason why you also would give it, not just for client facing, but obviously for vendor facing. I want you to think about what the SEC said today. If you're a small organization and you haven't used these, what I would call the client facing summaries in the past, they were mentioning today, look, your RFP responses, we've heard this before, got to think about what your responses are. If it's template-like responses, right, it becomes an advertisement. this is going to, if that's part of it, not saying that's an advertisement by any ways, okay, that would
That's a
be kind
different
of
panel.
odd, but I want you to think about it. There might be reasons, if you're starting to see those requests, or if you haven't, I think you may, okay? So there could be reasons why you want a consolidated 4-page report summary or so about what your annual review is. I also know that your senior management team, your CEO, president, what have you, they want the detailed report, your boards, okay? The other senior managers may appreciate the scripted version. So there's other reasons for that as well. All right, I want to provide our second word for continuing education today, and that word is inspector. And the word is inspector. Okay. So, now we're going to go into the final, phase where we talk about, what do we do with what we discover. So, Gretchen, from time to time, there could be a material issue. And let's just say we've gone through Kevin's exercise of ascertaining, is it urgent, is it material, not material, what have you. So, other than, of course, engaging outside counsel as needed, okay, how do you typically handle this situation when there is a material issue?
Well, I think the first thing that you have to do is really understand the definition of material, because to Kevin's point, you're going to have to disclose that in a different way than if it's non-material. Mm-hmm. So at our firm, if anything is found to that effect, obviously it becomes my responsibility to talk with our CEO and senior management. And then through discussion, we decide how we're going to put that into our documentation and notes. And then if there's violations of policy in addition to it being a material issue. Mm-hmm. And then since we don't have a lot of requests as you're speaking to, it's pretty much an internal thing, but we make sure that we document it properly. So if the SEC does ask, we show that we found it, what we did, and then the remediation also.
Kevin, do you have anything to add in terms of if you happen to have, or if you had a challenging situation that you were facing, and you've identified a problem, how do you handle it?
Yeah, I'll broaden this lens out a bit. It's not just the annual review. Mm-hmm. If you are effective in your organization, there could be a lot of reasons why something comes across your desk or your phone or your email. So you always have to be thinking through a lens of what happens if the next thing that comes through this thing is a problem, right? So I kind of think of this through the just broader error correction, problem resolution lens, and that's why I kind of go back to my spectrum of, is this important? It might be really significant, or it might be something that we could do better, but it's not all that urgent, right? There's a lot of things here that are important that aren't urgent. There's a lot of things here that are significant that aren't material, right? So trying to figure out how to address those things. But then the other thing that I always think about in terms of communicating with my colleagues is I want to put them in a position to succeed. So my job is not to vomit problems onto other people's desks, right? If I need to communicate with a colleague, I need to be able to give them some perspective, some background, hopefully some suggestions or recommendations. I need to think about who the right person to call is, who the right person to talk to. We've talked about outside resources. There are perfectly good reasons why you might be on the phone to counsel, right? If it's really ugly, you're going to need some advice. You might need some privilege. Yeah. You might need to be going off in a different direction that involves HR. A lot of the role that a CCO really plays in these kind of things is thinking about mapping ahead, thinking about the strategy, but you can't have a one-size-fits-all. Like I said, I think about these things, but every fact pattern is probably going to require a little different approach, but hopefully it uses some of the same principles of deciding who, what, where, when, all those kind of things. So that's a very frustratingly vague answer, but hopefully those are principles that you can apply. And you also don't want to be the boy that called wolf. That's the other thing that I should throw out, right? True. Not, like I said, not everything that's important is significant or material. You have to remember your colleagues are trying to do their jobs and run a business too, right? So you are going to lose a lot of credibility if you take no responsibility for anything and just dump issues on somebody else's desk and said, here's something identified, you might need to pay attention to this. That ain't good either, right? So you're going to have to take the professional risk of making some judgments about what's important, what isn't. And it might be important, but it might be okay to get to them when their schedule clears next week, as opposed to, hunting them down today. Those kind of things are never going to show up in a policy and procedure, but those kind of judgment things will not only make you more effective, will hopefully make you a better contributor internally, whether it's compliance or not.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to pause here. Does anyone have any questions? It's been a quiet group today. Okay, I'm going to actually pose to you a question, and this is what I'm seeing. And I'm not saying it's an issue in your firm, but I want to kind of put all these concepts together today, okay? In the area of advisory fees, we've seen two different risk alerts that came out on advisory fees. And, the SEC was commenting about, are we disclosing everything to the end client about all the fees and expenses they're paying? Could be in the form of, we saw the 12B1 fees that have continued to come out in enforcement actions. We've seen advisory fee cases starting in 2018 where the end client wasn't aware of different fees that they were paying that impacted, and as the investor advocate says, every dollar that is not spent in the market is a dollar that the investor needs to be aware is not being invested, okay? And so with that in mind, as I'm been talking to a lot of different firms about what are their fee practices. And we find out, it's been dependent upon your shop. If you're institutional, this might not be the case, but you've got tiered fee schedules. People are defining householding different. Oh, we have a family office situation. Oh, it's an ultra high net worth family. So if they want to go out to and aggregate not just mom, dad, the minor children, maybe in some cases it'll be grandparents. Maybe it's aunts and uncles. But it's got in there. We can negotiate fees. And then we hear the SEC come back as they're going in exams and they start talking about fiduciary duty. Okay, we should treat everyone the same. Our fiduciary obligation is to act in their best interest. And we might have different definitions of what I'll call householding. Okay, I'm seeing this more and more. And then the firm is scratching their head. How do we define household? Do we have to apply this retroactively? Do we need to rebate fees? What about, oh my gosh, I found out that a client, they might have died, and my custodian now, they've got different processes. In the old days, the big custodians would say, you have to send me the death certificate. Now, if I call them, immediately they freeze my account. So when am I supposed to stop charging advisory fees? Because guess what? Their advisory contracts haven't been updated. Okay? And in the old contract, it was silent. What do we do in these cases?
From a very narrow perspective, the SEC, from a 20647 annual review perspective, they want to see that you've been thoughtful about it.
Everything
right?
like this.
They may not necessarily agree with all of the determinations that you've made or the judgments that you've made, and they may have different opinions about where you draw the line between material or not, but you'd rather get into a debate about some of those nuances rather than a debate whether you took it seriously at all. That doesn't mean it's going to absolve any questions they have about other parts of your business, but again, narrowly, wearing the CCO hat, this is a bit defensive-minded. So again, the bar that you're trying to clear here is showing that you've been thoughtful, that you're plugged in enough with your business to say, hey, this is my business model. I know that there are enough things here that are changing or fluid or subjective, and maybe that's something that we can wrap some things around. Again, the SEC might come in later and say, you know what, we're not enamored of that business practice. But you'd rather have them take issue with that than come in and say, oh, you didn't even think about it at all, did you?
Yeah, and I think, my point of bringing this up is, okay, I'm not giving you a solution. I'm not telling you how to resolve it. But in this final slide where we're giving our thoughts, okay, and we've given you also a top 10 list of things you should be thinking about for the annual review. I mean, I think Kevin put it best. You've got to be proactive and not reactive, and you're going to have to think about in that kind of a case, okay, let me go work with outside counsel. Let me be thoughtful and deliberate on what I'm documenting and what I'm not, because I am going to have to demonstrate I identified an issue, okay, where maybe it wasn't consistently applied. And then what are we going to do about it? And it's not that the sky's falling, okay, there is a solution here. But what we have to be thinking about is that's a risk. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn to all these different resources, work with outside counsel. I'm going to see what guidance has been provided in the industry through these risk alerts, through, in looking at, our own policies and procedures. The first thing I've got to do is make sure our internal controls address the risk. We identified it. Now I'm going to address it. And then what's the process we're going to take? And that's going to take time. It's going to take analysis. It's going to take wisdom from the CCO to give that guidance, and I don't envy your job. It is one of the absolute hardest professions out there in the industry. But more importantly, okay, this isn't doomsday. This process is about trying to identify these risks and taking that best step forward to implement effective change that's going to work for the business. So
Do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good either. Don't look at this and say it has to be gold-plated in every respect. Do something, even if it's not, super perfect or you wish you had $1 million of resources. Do something.
So in the last 30 seconds, final thoughts.
I would just say, no, you're not alone. The IAA is here for all of us. You have colleagues here with you. You can compare notes as to what's happening in your firm. There are outsourcing resources like Michelle's firm, and then, of course, there's outside counsel. So I wish you all good luck, and feel free to be in touch with us if you have any follow-up questions.
And don't forget your supplemental materials. Lots of good information, okay? Thank you so much. We'll stay up here if you have any questions.